The following program, President Grant, His Reflections, is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It is one of that series of programs wherein President Grant shares his reflections of persons, places, or events in his presidency or his life after the presidency. It is available on the free YouTube channel, General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, and on Facebook under President Grant by himself or Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, Cuba and trying to not go to war with Spain, Part 1. I am President Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in the library. And I should like to reflect a bit about Cuba and the problems we had with Cuba during my administration and trying to stay out of war with Spain. And this issue ran throughout my presidency, but today I should like to think aloud with you about the initial problems with Cuba and how we had to really try not to get involved in a war with Spain. In October of 1868, there was a revolt in Cuba. Plantation owners and many of the people in the country wanted to throw off Spanish rule that had been going on for centuries. And a very bloody civil war began. This was only, of course, 3 years after our own Civil War and just about 4 months before I took office in March of '69. And the revolt went on. It ultimately became known as the 10 Years' War. But more about that later. The war had started, and of course there was a great deal of fervor about we should get into the war and fight on the side of the rebels. People identified with them, trying to throw off the yoke of the cruel, oppressing country, civil war, and so forth ad nauseum. And I had to walk a tightrope, not to make too many people angry by not getting into the war, by recognizing the rebels as belligerents, which would have led to probably a declaration of war with Spain. And the problems were mounting, and pretty quickly mounting. Now the issue with Cuba is we were trying to stay neutral, and with the different offers that I'll talk about, the different resolutions, keep in mind that we didn't want to annex Cuba. We didn't want another state in the Caribbean, not the Cuban, because they're people so different from ours. And all the time I was working on trying to annex Santo Domingo as a naval base and to make the Caribbean Ocean an American lake and stay in the letter of the law and the intent of the Monroe Doctrine. But I didn't want to get into a war with Spain. That was the real problem with Cuba. Annexing Santo Domingo wouldn't have prompted a war with Spain. Getting involved with Cuba would. And at that time, since we had reduced our Navy immediately following the Civil War, we didn't have any Navy that could defeat the Spanish Navy. And that was a wake-up call for us because with the Spanish problems, we began to rebuild our own Navy. But about Cuba, we don't want Cuba as an annexation. We get $32 million a year from Cuba in imports, tariffs, and duties. That's a total of 18% of our United States government income. Yes, $32 million per year from Cuba, and that's 18% of our country's income. So we don't want to annex them and stop that. In a sense, we couldn't afford to annex Cuba. There are also some other issues. Cuba still has legal slavery, and Cuba has more than 500,000 slaves in bondage in the country. And that was a sore spot with, of course, everyone who had supported the abolition of slavery and the federal side of our late war. Cuba affects our trade, the revolt down there, because if they're fighting a war, our trade back and forth, sales and imports from Cuba, are suffering. So there was a business side of wanting to bring about a peace between the rebels in Cuba and the Cuban government. And they immediately went to New York City, the junta, and set up offices in New York City, began raising money, indeed began recruiting, although it was illegal, recruiting troops to go to Cuba and fight for the rebels, influencing our newspapers, which wasn't difficult to do because there was a great deal of fervor and growing fervor to support the rebels. As I said, many people were, North and South, were sympathizing with them. And Cuba was causing us the problem with Spain because Spain was accusing us of the same thing we were accusing England of during the Civil War, that we're supporting the rebels. We're indeed shipping them goods. We're making it easier for them to get men and materials of war, which sounds a great deal like what we are accusing Britain of doing in the Alabama claims and in building all of the Confederate raiders, the Alabama and the Shenandoah and so forth. The problems were parallel to what we had been putting up with in the war, and now we're trying to sue Great Britain. So I'm trying to put down and tamp down the fires to get involved with Cuba. Now, the greatest supporter, I think, of the war, of the rebels, was John Rawlins, my Secretary of War, who he sitteth at my right hand. And he was an ardent supporter of the rebels. And I was listening, of course, to him. He died not long after he took office, when I took office. But in his tenure there, how brief it may have been, he was an ardent supporter of the Cuban rebels. To balance that, though, my Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, was a strong opponent of getting into a conflict with Spain because we supported the rebels. And also the Monroe Doctrine, he would bring that up. And we don't need another war. We really do not want to get into a war. So what were solutions? Well, Spain was bowed under with debt, and they're also going from an elected government to a monarchy. And the elected government that we were talking with was really weak and obviously very shaky. So we don't know in our diplomacy if we're going to be dealing with an elected government or if we're going to be dealing with a monarchy, and who's going to stay in power over there. But with all of the war talk and the flames trying to rise, Hamilton Fish proposed to Spain a program wherein there was a ceasefire. First of all, stop the killing and give Cuba their independence with the ceasefire, abolish slavery, and maintain the armistice during negotiations to such that the people of Cuba could select independence or opt to stay with Spain. But we were trying to keep the peace with Spain, and Spain rejected that, and I didn't want to even take the issue to the Cuban rebels because Spain said they should lay down their arms. We're not. And I knew that the rebels would never go for that, so that wasn't even worth bringing to them. But in keeping peace with Spain, however we might do it, short of our national honor being sacrificed, it was cheaper than fighting a war. And as I said, the Spanish Navy was a significantly superior naval force to ours now that we've reduced the size of our Navy. And all the time, they're contracting with northeastern American shipbuilders to build boats for them. Well, that caused a problem because if I stopped the building of boats for Spain, then that's tacitly recognizing the rebels in Cuba. And I could not recognize as a belligerent either one, because then that would begin having our ships stopped on the high seas, and they were already being stopped by Spanish ships. But I'm dancing in a very difficult tune in trying to stay out of the war. We were saved with the boat issue, though, because through some diplomacy and urging on our part behind the scenes, Peru brought suit on the international scene with Spain over those boats that we were building because they said Spain's going to use the boats against them. Now, they'd had a war with Spain, Peru and Spain, from 1864 through 66. And with not too much of a stretch of a diplomatic imagination, it could be felt that the Peruvian contesting was legitimate in that they said the Spanish are going to use those boats against us. And it gave me time to look into how I could stop this legitimately, and I decided to refer it to the International Treaty of 1818, which was an old one dealing with international issues, and it would maybe keep us out of the war. I didn't want it to go to court because I knew a federal court would indeed issue the order, release the boats. But we were able to avoid a problem there. Spain dropped the matter with the boats. Now, Spain came back to us and said, buy Cuba for $150 million and no ceasefire. No ceasefire. Well, I knew that, as I said, that wasn't going to be accepted by the Cuban rebels. So we said no. With this, for the moment, nothing is going to work. Let's let some time pass and maybe cooler heads can prevail. At that time, though, Prussia stepped in and said, we'll use our good offices to help negotiate a settlement between the Cuban rebels and the Spanish government. But we declined. Hamilton Fish told the Prussians, we appreciate your offer, but we declined. However, know that we are not going to sit idly by and let another European power come in and negotiate any kind of peace or be involved in any way between the Cuban rebels and the Cuban government backed by the Spanish government and have Cuba become a protectorate or a colony of another European power. Once this issue is resolved in Cuba, there will be no more colonies from anybody in Europe in the Western Hemisphere invoking the Monroe Doctrine. So I'm still, all this time, trying to push through a treaty with Santo Domingo. And I'm doing another balancing act with the Senate in wanting them to approve the treaty by going along with the best solution for the majority opinion of not recognizing the Cuban rebels, yet not alienating senators to such that they would vote against my proposal about not recognizing the rebels. It became so critical that in my first message, annual message to Congress, I referenced these issues, and I should like to read you what I said. Now, this is my first annual message to Congress, December the 6th of 1869. As the United States is the freest of all nations, so do its people sympathize with all people struggling for liberty and self-government. But while sympathizing, it is due to our honor that we should abstain from enforcing our views upon unwilling nations, and from taking on taking an interested part without invitation in the quarrels between different nations, or between nations and their subjects. Our course should always be in conformity with strict justice and law, international and local. Such has been the policy of the administration in dealing with these questions. For more than a year, a valuable province of Spain, and a near neighbor of ours, in whom all our people cannot but help to feel a deep interest, has been struggling for independence and freedom. Belligerency has not been accorded, however, because, according to the principles here enunciated, I have not deemed such a course just. The people and government of the United States entertain the same warm feelings and sympathies for the people of Cuba through their pending struggle that they manifested throughout the previous struggles between Spain and our former colonies in behalf of the latter. But the contest has at no time assumed the conditions which amount to a war, in the sense of international laws, or which have shown the existence of a de facto political organization of the insurgents sufficient to justify a recognition of belligerency. To this date, we have no evidence that the government of Free Cuba has a permanent seat of government, a single port into which to carry prizes, admiralty or other courts to adjudicate prizes or to administer justice, and without all or some of these requisites, I have not felt justified in recognizing the belligerency. The principle is maintained, however, that this nation is its own judge when to accord belligerency, either to a people struggling to free themselves from a government that they believe oppressive, or to nations at war with each other. The United States have no disposition to interfere with the existing relations of Spain to her colonial possessions on this continent. They believe that in due time Spain, as well as other European powers, will find their interest in terminating those relations and establishing the present dependencies as independent powers, members of the family of nations. These dependencies are no longer regarded as subject to transfer from one European power to another. When the present relation of colonies ceases, they are to become independent powers, exercising the right of choice and of self-control in the determination of their future condition and relations with others. The United States, in order to put a stop to bloodshed in Cuba and in the interest of a neighboring people, proposed their good offices to bring a termination to the contest, the offer not being accepted by Spain on a basis which we believe could be accepted by Cuba, was withdrawn. It is hoped that the good offices proposed to the United States may yet prove advantageous for the settlement of this unhappy strife. In order to put a stop to bloodshed in Cuba, informally tendered their good offices upon a basis that they had reason to believe would be acceptable to Spain, that is, independence of Cuba, cessation of hostilities by armistice, abolition of slavery, and purchase of the island by Cuba. The Spanish government replied informally they would accept the tender and suggested instead a different basis, the insurgents to lay down their arms, an amnesty to be proclaimed, a vote to be taken on independence, independence to be granted by Spain on payment of purchase money or its guarantee by the United States. The United States declined to offer a proposition which the Cubans could not be induced to accept, and their good offices, having been accepted, formally renewed the proposition before made informally. Spain replied that the offer was an embarrassing one to her, that she desired the good offices of the United States and would indicate later when and how they could be used. A number of illegal expeditions against Cuba have been broken up. It has been the endeavor of the administration to execute the neutrality laws in good faith, no matter how unpleasant the task, made so by the sufferings to which we have endured by lack of like good faith towards us by other nations. Under the arbitrary laws of Spain for embargoing and confiscating the property of persons supposed to favor the insurrection, several large claims have arisen for illegal and unjust interference with the rights and property of citizens of the United States. When the decree under which the authorities acted was promulgated, the Secretary of the U.S. pointed out to the Spanish minister that unless enforced with great caution, it might give rise to disputes between American citizens and Spanish authorities. The United States have been vigorous and outspoken in their remonstrances against the barbarous and cruel way of conducting the war, especially against the shootings of prisoners of war taken with arms in their hands without trial and conviction. Our remonstrances have been coupled with the demand for indemnity to the families of sailors Speakman and Wyeth, two American citizens who were shot without trial for being concerned in an expedition of which they declared and were probably prepared to prove their innocence. I have always felt that the most intimate relations should be cultivated between the Republic of the United States and all independent nations on this continent. It may be well worth considering whether new treaties between us and them may not be profitably entered into to secure more intimate relations, friendly, commercial, and otherwise. At this time, after that annual message, we were working desperately to avoid war with Spain, not recognizing the Cuban rebels as a legitimate force or as a legitimate free Cuba government, trying not to get into a war with Spain, trying to protect American citizens that were being taken off of vessels on the high seas, being shot, executed by firing squad without benefit of trial, without benefit of the counsel of the United States Embassy or ambassadors. So it was a very thorny issue to have to deal with. But we were able to avoid war with Spain ultimately, although it was a narrow escape. But I shall talk about that in the next part 2 discussion about the Spanish question, Cuba, and avoiding war with Spain. But for now I have said quite enough, and I bid you, as President Ulysses S. Grant, a fond adieu.